Memory is when you look back and the answers float in to who, what, when, where. The members who were then are repeated on a screen, are moved in a miniature drama, are collected and recollected for actions, speeches, silences set forth by images of the mind. This is memory, sometimes slurred and blurred. This is remembering. I was born on a corn husk mattress. This was in a 3-room frame house on 3rd Street, the second house east of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad tracks in Galesburg, Illinois. The date was January 6, 1878. I was born a little after midnight, my mother told me. My father was a black Swede, his hair straight and black, his eyes black with a hint of brown, eyes rather deep set in the bone, and the skin crinkled with his smile or laugh. He worked at the CB&Q blacksmith shop, mauling away at engine and car parts the year round with no vacations, from 7 o'clock in the morning till the 6 o'clock whistle. Then he stood sledge alongside anvil and walked home. His hands thick with calluses, he was strictly a horny-handed son of toil. And the mother, Clara Matilda Anderson, who had married my father, what was she like? She had fair hair, the color of oat straw, just before the sun tans it, eyes light blue, the skin white as fresh linen by candlelight, the mouth for smiling. She had 10 smiles for us to 1 from our father. She did the cooking, washing, sewing, bed making, and house cleaning for the family of 9 persons. She often said, there are so many interesting things in life, wonders made by God for us to think about. When I was 3, we moved to another 3-room, 1-story house, this on South Street, 3 doors west of Pearl. Here I wore dresses and watched my father spade a garden and plant and dig potatoes and carrots. Here we had the mare Dolly, who pulled us in a wagon out from town streets and houses to the farm of our kinfolk, the Kranzes. There I saw for the first time the open country, rolling prairie and timber, fields of corn and oats, cows, sheep, and horses feeding in pastures. Grazing animals in the open had wonder for me then and always will. When I was about 4, we moved 2 blocks over to Berrien Street and a 10-room house with a long, roomy 3rd-floor garret running the length of the house. It was really 2 houses and lots. We lived in the western rooms and rented out the east. Here, the immigrant Swede, August Sandburg, set himself up with due humility and constant anxiety as a landlord. In the house at 62224 East Berrien Street, I was to live growing formative years from 1882 to 1899, from dresses to short pants to long pants, from a babbler with bibs to a grown young man. The day came when I started off for the 4th Ward School, 4 blocks from our house at Mulberry and Allen's Avenue. In the primary room, I learned the letters of the alphabet and how with letters you can spell words. We had a thin book with a green cover called a primer. Though I had been solemnly christened with holy water sprinkled on my infant head by the name of Carl August Sandburg, somewhere in the first year or 2 of school, I decided to use the name Charles instead of Carl. I'm not sure just why I did that. It could have been I'd had the feeling that the name Carl would mean one more poor Swede boy, while the name Charles filled the mouth full and had him guessing. The next year, our block on Berrien Street was moved over into the 7th Ward, and we had to walk 6 blocks more to school. There I learned more about the numbers from 1 to 10 and how they can slide and slip away from you. I also got straightened out about the earth. I had been going along with the idea that the earth is flat. I'd been here and there a few miles out from Galesburg, and I had never noticed the earth was anything but flat. Now I had a geography, and it said that men had sailed around this ball, the earth. I hugged my geography and called it the best book yet. It made me read the sky and the weather as though they were books. On the cinder-covered 7th Ward schoolyard, we had a 15-minute recess at 10:30 in the morning. A high wooden fence ran back from the school building to keep the boys and girls apart at recess. Now, there were boys who cut holes in the fence or knocked out knotholes to peek through. And what they saw was the same girls they saw in class or after school. Well, eventually, the 6th grade came, and Miss Lottie Goldquist, Swedish mixed with Yankee, a little woman without a lazy bone in her body. They said she had get up and get. One of her favorite words was education, and she said you could never get enough of it. I was 10 years old when the strike of the railroad engineers hit Galesburg, a division point. The slogan of the strikers was a takeoff on the letters C, B, and Q. Come, boys, and quit railroading. The boys I ran with, the striking engineers whom I knew to speak to, the wild and furious talk against scabs hit deep in me. I was a partisan. And why was I all for the strikers and against the railroad? It could be that I knew some good men among the strikers, and they were human, and I liked them. Whereas the Q Railroad was a big, unhuman something that refused to recognize and deal with the engineers, who in all weathers took their locomotives out along the rails, hoping to pull through without a collision or a slide down an embankment. I was a little 10-year-old partisan. Well, I finished the 7th Ward school. I could feel I was growing up halfway toward being a man. It was quite a change to walk twice a day to the grammar school downtown and walk a mile home again. The grammar school stood a short block from the public square. Between stood the old First Church, built more than 40 years before by the first settlers. From then on until several years later, what schooling I got was outside of schools, from reading books, newspapers, and magazines, from watching and listening to many kinds of people and what they were doing and saying. When us kids got together, talk would run to why women wore bustles, why they wore tight-laced corsets, why a woman with a pretty face would hide it with a black veil. When a young woman crossed a muddy street, we watched whether she lifted her skirts high enough so that we could see what her legs were like. We watched to see if Friday the 13th was unlucky, and we didn't see it. We heard that it was bad luck to step over a broom or walk under a ladder, so some kids went around stepping over brooms and walking under ladders, and nothing happened. One kid said that when an uncle of his had a cold, he kissed a mule on the nose, and the cold went away. In 1884, when a kid called me a mugwump, I called it back at him. From the grown-ups, we had learned of high-up Republicans who didn't like Blaine's record, couldn't trust him, and were going to vote for Cleveland. The regular Republicans called these others mugwumps. I heard a Blaine Republican say, a mugwump is a man who sits with his mug on one side of the fence and his wump on the other. Well, we heard other expressions and sayings. Hey, you're all right, but your feet stink. I'll give you a brick house, one brick at a time. If I was as ugly as you, I'd sue my father and mother. On parting of an evening in the 1880s, we used to say, good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. Later, this was considered babyish. We heard, every man has his price, and every woman has her figure. We heard a grown man say, "I don't know nothing, and what I do know ain't so." These sayings and stories on the streets and in the schoolyard stick in the memory like cockleburrs on a pants leg. When the circus came to town, we managed to shake out of sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning, grab a slice of bread and butter, and make a fast walk to the Q yards to watch the unloading in early daylight. A grand, clear voice the man had who rode his horse a half block ahead of the elephants in the parade and cried out, "The elephants are coming, watch your horses." First to one side of the street and then the other, he cried it, and those who had skittish horses watched them. After the unloading, we went home for a quick breakfast and a run to the circus grounds, a big pastured Maine and Farnham out near the city limits. If we were lucky, we got jobs at carrying water for the elephants or lugging to the big tent the boards for the people to sit on. After 3 hours of this useful and necessary work, we were presented with slips of paper that let us in to see the big show in the afternoon. If we hadn't been lucky, and if we didn't have the 50 cents for a ticket, we tried to slide under the canvas and crawl to where we could peek through boards and between legs to see. Years later, it came over me that at first sight of the freaks, I was sad because I was bashful. Except at home and among playmates, it didn't come easy for me to be looked at. And there at the sideshow were these people, the freaks, and the business, the work of each one of them was to be looked at. Well, I didn't like the feel of eyes being laid on me. I would pass people on the street, and when they had gone by, I wondered if they'd turned their head for another look at me. Walking down a church aisle between hundreds of people, I had a feeling of eyes on me. Now, this was silly, but when you're bashful, you have that feeling of eyes following you and boring through you. I was 11 when I had the first regular job that paid me cash. My employer was the real estate firm of Callender and Rodine on the second floor of a building on Main, midway between Kellogg and Prairie. They gave me a key to the office, and I unlocked the door about 7:45 each morning, Monday through Friday. I took a broom, made a broom corn grown near Galesburg, and manufactured in Mr. Boyer's broom factory. And I swept out the offices and then emptied and washed the brass spittoons. I came to know every floorboard of that office, where I had to dig in and push to bring out the dust. This morning service of mine for Callender and Rodine took less than a half hour, and every Friday morning Mr. Callender would bring his right hand out of a pocket and pay me 25 cents of the United States money, a silver quarter of a dollar. On the second floor, a few doors west of the Callender and Rodine office, was the printing press and office of the Galesburg Republican Register. Now, this place we carrier boys went to as soon as school let out at 3:30 in the afternoon. As the papers came off the press, we took them to a table and folded them with 3 motions. Then, with a bundle of papers under my left arm, I went down the stairs to Main Street, turned north at the next corner, and went up Prairie Street. I learned how to cross-fold a paper so it could be thrown spang against the front door. If a house was near enough, I didn't have to leave the sidewalk to make my throw. On Prairie Street, however, lived the rich and the well-to-do. Most of their houses set back so far from the sidewalk that I walked in halfway or near to the house before making my throw. At one house set well back, a man would often be at home and expecting me, and more yet, expecting the latest telegraph news over America and the wide world. This man expecting me would step out of the door to take the paper from my hand. He was the most roly-poly fat man in town. Now, there were other fat men who stood bigger and weighed more, but no other so roly-poly. He was round everywhere you looked at him. No straight lines, even his back curved. He was a waddly barrel of a man. This was the Honorable Clark E. Carr. He's mentioned often as the Republican Party boss of Knox County and having a hand in national politics, too. This roly-poly man taking the Republican Register from my hand had met Lincoln in party powwows, had heard Lincoln tell stories. And Clark E. Carr said of Lincoln, he could make a cat laugh. Well, having left Mr. Carr with the latest news about how President Cleveland and the Democrats were ruining the country, I went on with my papers to the end of my route. I walked about 2 miles, and in good weather it took about an hour and a quarter. The Republican Register paid me $1 silver a week. I was more than satisfied with that weekly silver dollar and delivered papers for more than 2 years. I was about 13 years of age when, with 7 other boys, I took the sacrament and was confirmed as a member of the Elam Lutheran Church. We trained for weeks under our pastor, Carl Neiblet. I was 14 and coming near 15 of October of 1892. I got up every morning at 5:30, came down from the garret to breakfast my mother made, then walked 2 miles out to the Academy in Losi and the house and barn of George Burton, who had 2 milk wagons. The country was having what everyone called hard times, so like all other milk wagon helpers, I worked 7 days a week, no vacations, no holidays, pouring the pints and quarts on the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. In this October, I went to bed 2 days with a sore throat. Then Mart came down with it, and it was 4 days before he was up and around. Then Emil and Freddie went to bed with throats so sore they couldn't eat. Dr. Wilson came, examined them, and his face was sober and sorry as he spoke those 3 words, "It is diphtheria." 3 days later, Emil and Freddie both died. And we saw the 2 little white caskets carried out the front door and put in the black hearse with the glass windows. Mother cried. And now we were a family of 7. Mr. Burton didn't seem concerned one way or another. He never said a word about it. He was that kind of man. He never sang for himself or me, never joked to me, never told a funny story, never talked much at all. What few times I tried to talk to him, well, he either cut me off short or said nothing, as if I'd said nothing to him. It was a hard winter, and somehow I couldn't see my way clear to take out of my pay even enough for a pair of dollar overshoes. In the hard times, my father worked only 4 hours a day, his month's paycheck less than $16, so the $12 a month that George Burton paid me came in handy for the family. They knew at home that I was a helper through the hard times, that the little I earned counted. They knew I would rather have gone to school. When Mary graduated from high school, we knew that diploma would count. The next fall, she taught at a country school at $30 a month. And I read her high school books and discussed with her what was in them. It came over me often that I wasn't getting anywhere in particular. I asked here and there about a job where I might learn a trade. I heard that the Union Hotel barbershop wanted a porter. I said, barbering is a trade. A barber can travel, can work in other towns from coast to coast. So I hired Mr. Humphrey at $3 a week, shoe shine money and tips. The shop was under the Farmers and Mechanics Bank in a half basement with big windows that let you see the shoes of walkers on the sidewalk. By going up 8 steps, you could see the public square, down Broad Street to the courthouse park, and beyond that, the Knox College campus. There I shined shoes, brushed off the customers when they got out of their chairs, and ran the bathhouse next to the barber shop. Sometimes, watching people come in the hotel, I try to figure out whether they were traveling men or show people, dated for one night in the auditorium across Broad Street from the hotel. The Union Hotel got most of the big-time people who came to town, show people, lecturers, minstrels, star actors who'd been playing on Broadway and were taking their play west. Galesburg made a nice one-night stand for them. The auditorium stage was big enough to handle any show from Broadway, and nearly every Broadway hit heading west made a stop at Galesburg on the Q main line to Denver and Omaha. Sometimes I worked backstage moving scenery or as a supernumerary. With the coming of the movies, the auditorium faded and folded, but I give it my blessing. Spring came after fall and winter months in the barber shop, and doubts had been growing in me that I wasn't cut out to be a barber. One day, Sam Barlow stopped his milk wagon, called me from a sidewalk, and asked if I wanted to go to work for him at $12 a month and dinner with him and his wife every day. I took him up on it. It would be outdoor work. I would see plenty of sky every day. That barber shop had been getting stuffy. So every morning for 16 months or more, I walked from home at 6:30 west to Monmouth Boulevard in the house and barn of Sam Barlow and helped him deliver milk on the south part of town. Working for Barlow, I got overshoes and no chilblains. Sam was a good man, friendly and talkative, and I enjoyed working with him. We stayed good friends as long as he lived. At home, on the milk wagon or waiting for it, I read several times William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech that swept the Democratic National Convention and swung to Bryan the nomination for president. I followed his speeches across the country, and I heard him speak in Galesburg and later in Monmouth, riding there and back on the cow-catcher of a Q locomotive. He was my hero, the man of the people who spoke for the right, and against him were the enemies of the people. He opened his mouth, and the words pouring out were, for me in that year, truth and gospel. Later, I would find out he was a voice, an orator, an actor, and not much of a thinker. On my way to Barlow's, I walked across the Knox College campus and passed the front of the old Main building. Every morning I saw the east front of Old Main where they'd put up the platform for Lincoln and Douglas to debate in October of 1858. At the north front of Old Main, many times I read on a bronze plate words spoken by Lincoln to 20,000 people on a cold, windy October day. He is blowing out the moral lights around us, who contends that whoever wants slaves has a right to hold them. I read those words in winter sunrise, in broad summer daylight, in falling snow or rain, in all the weathers of a year. And those words stayed with me. In those years, as a boy in that prairie town, I got education in scraps and pieces of many kinds, not knowing they were part of my education. I met people in Galesburg who were puzzling to me, and later when I read Shakespeare, I found those same people were puzzling him. I met little wonders of many kinds among animals and plants that never lost their wonder for me. And I found later that those same wonders had a deep interest for Emerson, Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. I met superstitions, folk tales, and folklore long before I read books about them. All had their parts, small or large, in the education I got outside of books and schools. Often in the 1890s, I would get to thinking about what a young prairie town Galesburg was. Nearly 20,000 people, and they'd all come in 50 years. Before that, it was empty, rolling prairie. And I'd ask, why did they come? Why couldn't they get along where they'd started from? Was Galesburg any different from the many other towns, some bigger and some smaller? Did I know America, the United States, because of what I knew about Galesburg? It didn't bother me or keep me awake nights, but I couldn't help thinking about it and asking, what is this America I'm a part of, where I will soon be a full citizen and a voter? All of us are living under the American flag, the stars and stripes. What does it mean? Men have died for it. Why? When they say it's a free country, they mean free for what and free for whom? And what is freedom? I said I would listen and read and ask, and maybe I would learn. By guessing and hoping and reaching out, I might get a hold on some of the answers. Those questions may not have run through my mind, yet they ran in my blood. Dark and tangled, they were to run in my blood for many years. For some of the questions I would across the years get only half answers, mystery answers. And I'll be back with some of those answers right after this intermission. This small town of Galesburg, as I look back on it, was a piece of the American Republic. Breeds and blood strains that figure in history were there for me as a boy to see and hear in their faces and their ways of talking and acting. There was no standard pioneer cut to a regular pattern. Many had vivid personalities, their lives striped with color. As a boy, I saw some of these old-timers in their 70s or 80s, hard-bitten, grizzled, and fading. I saw them on Main Street, at the county fair, at celebrations, at the old settlers' picnic at Gums Grove near Knoxville. They had broken the prairie, laid the first roads and streets, built the first schools and churches, colored the traditions of the town and country where I was born and raised. I tried in my boy mind to picture them standing where there wasn't a wall or roof on Main Street, no streets anywhere and no houses. There they looked around and decided where to clear for the first row of houses, the public square, the church, the blacksmith shop, the general store, and the college, to be the focus of light and hope for the youth and the coming generations. They saw their little town rise to be a place and a name, where before had been silence, broken only by wild animal cries, by the recurring rains and winds. These old-timers became part of my mind and memory, working dimly but definitely. They were living segments of history, specimens and vestiges, breathing evidences in the building of America.